There are places that exist only after midnight. Places forgotten by maps, ignored by history, and remembered only by those who have dreamed of them. This is one of those places. Here, every shelf holds a story someone tried to forget. Every drawer contains a memory that refused to stay buried. Every page waits patiently for the one person destined to read it. The keeper of these forgotten things is known only as the Archivist. No one knows where they came from. The nightmares no one admits to. The impossible encounters dismissed as dreams. The names whispered just before waking. Tonight, another file has found its way to these shelves. Another forgotten account waits to be opened, so settle in. Keep the lights low and listen carefully, because once a story is read aloud, it has a way of remembering you. There are places where people say the fish simply stopped biting, not because the water became polluted, not because the seasons changed, but because something beneath the surface became full. Old fishermen have a saying they rarely explain to strangers. If the lake gives you every fish you ask for, leave before it asks for something in return. Most laugh when they hear it, until they find themselves alone at the edge of still water, watching a line disappear beneath the surface without so much as a ripple. Some stories tell of haunted lakes. Others tell of monsters that sleep beneath black water. Those stories are easier to believe because monsters can be hunted, lakes can be avoided. But an ordinary object, one that sits quietly in a garage, or leans forgotten against the wall of a bait shop, or rests unnoticed beneath a table at an estate sale, that is far more patient. Tonight's artifact appeared insignificant: a weathered fishing pole, oak handle, steel guides, a reel that refused to rust. Nothing unusual. Until investigators realized they had photographed the same fishing pole. Across nearly 170 years, it appeared beside empty boats, abandoned docks, collapsed piers, riverbanks where no footprints ever led away. Every owner vanished. Every witness remembered the same thing. They all said the fisherman smiled, right before disappearing beneath perfectly calm water. No struggle, no scream, only the sound of a fishing reel slowly turning. Evidence recovered from several counties suggests the pole was never inherited, never sold intentionally, never gifted. It simply appeared. Sometimes after a storm, sometimes washed ashore beside driftwood, sometimes leaning against a tree where no one remembered leaving it. Those who picked it up often remarked how comfortable it felt, as though it had already been broken in. Specifically for them, it always caught fish at first, the largest anyone had ever seen. Enough to earn photographs, enough to inspire stories, enough to convince every owner they had stumbled upon the greatest fishing rod ever made. By the time they realized the catches were becoming different, it was already too late. The oldest surviving account doesn't begin with a fisherman. It begins with a woman, a healer, a widow, a woman the nearby village called a witch. Whether she truly practiced magic, or whether fear simply demanded someone to blame, no record can say for certain. But every version of the story ends the same way, with a curse, a length of black thread, and 7 carefully tied knots. Tonight, we open evidence locker 19. Artifact number for dot known only by the name written across every recovered file. The last cast. Long before anyone feared the fishing pole, People feared the woman who owned it, not because she carried weapons, not because she threatened anyone, but because she understood things the village could not explain. She lived alone on the northern shore of Blackbriar Lake, where the trees grew so densely together that sunlight rarely reached the ground. A narrow trail wound through the forest to a modest cabin built from hand-cut timber. Moss climbed the walls. Wildflowers grew in careful rows beneath the windows. Smoke drifted from the stone chimney almost every evening, carrying the scent of cedar and dried herbs into the woods. Most people only visited when they had no other choice: a child with a fever, a husband injured beneath a fallen tree, a mother unable to sleep after months of grief. The woman always welcomed them. She never asked for coins if a family could not afford them. Sometimes she accepted fresh bread, sometimes a basket of vegetables, sometimes nothing at all beyond a quiet thank you. Those who left her cabin often recovered. Fevers broke, wounds healed, nightmares faded. And for many years, that was enough. But gratitude is a fragile thing. It survives only as long as fortune does. When the harvests began to fail, the whispers returned. A spring frost arrived weeks too late. Fields of corn withered beneath an unforgiving summer. The fish that usually crowded the shallows became strangely scarce. Hunters wandered the forests for days without finding so much as a single deer. People searched for reasons, they always do. Some blamed the weather. Others blamed bad luck, but fear prefers a face. Before long, conversations in the village square ended with quiet glances toward the northern woods. The widow by the lake. I've heard she speaks to things no one can see. They say the crows gather outside her cabin before every storm. My brother swears she knew his name before he'd spoken a single word. Stories changed with every telling. Someone claimed she'd been seen walking through the forest long after midnight, carrying a lantern that cast no light. Another insisted the lake became perfectly still whenever she approached its shoreline. Children dared one another to stand near the path leading to her cabin after sunset. None ever walked it alone. Yet the woman remained exactly as she had always been. Each morning she gathered herbs growing between the stones. She collected rainwater in wooden barrels. She dried lavender beneath the porch roof. She mended torn blankets. She brewed medicines. And every evening, she carried a single wooden fishing pole to the lake. The pole was old, older than anyone remembered. Its oak handle had been polished smooth by decades of careful hands. The reel clicked softly with every turn, never hurried, never strained. She fished not for sport, but for supper. One fish was enough, too, if winter was near. She never kept more than she needed. When the basket held enough for the day, she thanked the quiet water, packed her things, and returned home before darkness settled over the trees. The lake seemed to know her. Even on windy evenings, the water around her line remained calm. Birds landed nearby without fear. Turtles climbed onto sunken logs beside her boots. Some said the animals trusted her because she fed them through harsh winters. Others whispered they obeyed her. The truth was likely much simpler. She understood patience. Nature often rewards those who ask for little. Years passed this way. The seasons turned. Snow covered the cabin roof. Spring returned. Summer warmed the lake. Autumn painted the forest in deep shades of amber and crimson. And through every season, the old fishing pole remained at her side. Its line was replaced countless times, its reel repaired with careful hands. Its would rubbed with oil each autumn before the first freeze. To the woman, it was merely a trusted companion. A simple tool that had provided countless quiet evenings by the water. She could never have imagined that before another season had passed, it would remember every hand that touched it, every promise whispered over it, every life it would one day claim. Because curses are rarely born in moments of hatred alone, they begin with grief, and grief, when given enough time, learns how to wait. By the time autumn settled over Blackbriar Lake, the village had grown quieter, not because life had become easier, but because hope had become difficult to find. The fields yielded only enough grain to survive another week. Fishing nets returned lighter each morning. Hunters wandered farther into the wilderness, returning with tired eyes and empty hands. The church bell rang more often than it once had, not for celebration, but for funerals. When fear lingers long enough, it begins searching for certainty. And certainty, even when it is wrong, feels comforting. The whispers that had once drifted between neighbors were now spoken openly in the village square. It started after she came here. The lake listens to her. She takes more than she gives. I've seen smoke rising from her chimney when no fire should still be burning. No one questioned where the stories began anymore. Only how many had heard them. Among those voices was a fisherman named Elias Thorne. He was respected, strong, honest by most accounts. The kind of man whose words carried weight simply because he rarely raised his voice. His father had fished Blackbriar Lake, his grandfather before him. The lake had fed his family for generations. Now, for the first time in his life, he returned home empty-handed. Every day, his wife quietly rationed what little food remained. His children had begun asking questions he could no longer answer. When will there be fish again? When can we have stew? Will winter be over soon? Each question settled heavier than the last. One evening, after another fruitless day on the water, Elias stood outside the chapel while a crowd gathered around him. Someone mentioned the widow, another agreed, then another, until suspicion no longer sounded like suspicion. It sounded like fact. If she can bless the lake, one man muttered, then perhaps she can curse it. The silence that followed was enough. The idea took root. By the next morning, nearly 24 villagers walked the narrow trail toward the cabin beneath the pines. No one carried farming tools. No fishing baskets. Only axes, torches, and certainty. The widow was kneeling beside her herb garden when she heard them approaching. She stood slowly, brushed the soil from her hands, and waited. She did not run. She did not plead. She simply watched as familiar faces emerged from the trees. People she had healed. People whose children she had delivered into the world. People whose wounds she had stitched, whose fevers she had broken, whose grief she had quietly shared. Not one met her eyes. Elias stepped forward. His voice trembled despite his effort to sound firm. You've brought this upon us. The woman tilted her head gently. I've done nothing but tend this place. The fish are gone. The crops have failed. The children are starving. And you expect us to believe it is all chance. For a long moment, she said nothing, then quietly replied, the earth has its seasons, the lake has its own. You cannot command either. Someone behind Elias shouted, liar. Another threw a stone. It struck the cabin wall with a dull crack. Then another, Glass shattered. A lantern fell from its hook. Someone lifted a torch. The dry cedar shingles caught almost immediately. Flames climbed the roof with frightening speed. The woman turned only once, looking toward the doorway where shelves of dried herbs, journals, and carefully collected remedies began disappearing behind smoke. Years of quiet work, gone in moments. She closed her eyes, not in anger, in mourning. The villagers expected screams, or curses, or desperate pleas. Instead, she walked calmly toward the small wooden rack beside the porch. There, leaning exactly where she had left it after fishing the evening before, was her old fishing pole. She lifted it with both hands, ran her fingers slowly across the smooth oak handle, then looked toward Elias. "You came to take my home." Her voice was soft enough that several people leaned closer just to hear. "You came to take my name. You came to take the kindness I gave freely." She lowered her eyes to the fishing pole. "So I shall leave you with something that never forgets." From the pocket of her apron, she withdrew a length of black thread. It was simple, no thicker than ordinary sewing thread. Yet the moment it caught the afternoon light, the wind stopped. Even the fire seemed to quiet. She wrapped the thread around the handle once, then tied a knot. For the innocent, a second knot. For the forgotten, a third. For the betrayed, a fourth. For those who were never believed, a fifth. For every kindness repaid with fear, a sixth. For every truth buried beneath lies, finally. She tied the seventh knot. This one took the longest. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled it tight. The lake, which moments before had reflected the burning cabin, became perfectly still. Not a ripple disturbed its surface, not a bird called from the trees. Not a single leaf moved. She rested one hand upon the cork handle and whispered words no witness would ever fully remember. Some recalled hearing. "May every cast return with more than was asked." Others insisted, she said, "May the greedy always answer the pull." But every account agreed on her final sentence. She looked directly at Elias Thorne and said, "You wished never to return home empty-handed." A long silence followed. "So you never shall." The thread darkened. The wood beneath her hand felt suddenly warm. For the briefest moment, those standing nearest swore they heard something, not from the woman, not from the fire, but from the fishing pole itself. A single, quiet click, as though an unseen reel had turned by one careful notch. The fire consumed the cabin long before sunset. By nightfall, nothing remained except a blackened stone chimney standing alone beside the lake. The villagers lingered only long enough to convince themselves they had done what was necessary. Some watched the flames with folded arms. Others quietly turned away before the roof collapsed. No one spoke to the widow again. In fact, no one could later agree on where she had gone. A few insisted she had walked calmly into the forest while the cabin burned. Others swore they had seen her standing at the edge of the lake until darkness swallowed her silhouette. One frightened child claimed she had simply vanished. The only thing everyone remembered was that the fishing pole had disappeared with her. By morning, the ashes had cooled. The trail leading to the cabin lay empty. The herb garden had been reduced to scorched earth. The barrels that once collected rainwater had split from the heat. The shelves of dried plants and handwritten journals were gone forever. Only the lake appeared untouched. Its surface reflected the pale autumn sky as though nothing had happened at all. For several days, life returned to what passed for normal. The villagers convinced themselves they had ended the curse before it could spread. They spoke less about the widow, less about the lake, less about what they had done, because silence can feel remarkably similar to forgiveness, especially when one wishes to forget. But Elias Thorne could not forget. Each morning he awoke before sunrise. Each evening he stood at the edge of the water, staring across the still surface. The lake had always been familiar to him. Now, it felt as though something beneath it watched him in return. His wife noticed the change first. He spoke less, ate little. Sometimes she would find him sitting outside long after midnight, listening to the distant sound of water against the shore. When she asked what troubled him, he always answered the same way. "I keep thinking I hear someone reeling in a line." There were no boats on the lake, no fishermen. Only the slow whisper of reeds bending in the wind. A week after the fire, Elias decided he would fish again. Winter was drawing closer. His family could not survive much longer without food. Before dawn, he carried his tackle to the shoreline where he had spent nearly his entire life. The mist drifted low across the water. The air carried the sharp scent of wet pine and cold earth. He prepared his hooks, checked his line, reached into his tackle box for bait, then stopped, resting against the old wooden dock, as though someone had leaned it there only moments before. Was a fishing pole his fishing pole? The same smooth oak handle, the same polished reel, the same black thread. 7 perfectly tied knots circled the grip beneath the reel seat. Elias frowned. He was certain he had never owned such a rod, yet somehow, holding it felt strangely familiar. The cork handle settled naturally into his palm, balanced perfectly, as though it had been crafted specifically for him. He glanced around the shoreline. No footprints, no boat, no fishermen searching for lost equipment. Only silence. He considered leaving it where it rested. Instead, he picked it up. The reel turned with effortless precision, soft, smooth, almost content. He tied on a simple hook, pressed a worm onto the point, walked to the end of the dock, and made his first cast. The lure sailed farther than he intended. The line landed without a splash before the ripples had even faded. The rod bent sharply. Instinct took over. Elias pulled back. The reel sang. Moments later, a bass larger than any he had ever caught broke the surface. Its scales shimmered like polished silver beneath the morning sun. He laughed, a genuine laugh. The first in many weeks. By noon, he had filled 2 baskets. Fish after fish struck the line almost instantly. Large, healthy, strong. The kind fishermen dream of catching once in a lifetime. He returned to the village smiling. Neighbors gathered around to admire his haul. Questions filled the air. Where did you find them? What bait did you use? What part of the lake? Elias simply shrugged. I suppose my luck finally changed that evening. For the first time in months, his family ate until no one remained hungry. His children smiled, his wife laughed. The weight that had rested upon his shoulders seemed to lift. But long after everyone had gone to bed, Elias remained awake. The fishing pole rested against the wall beside the fireplace. The room was silent. The fire had nearly burned out then. Very softly, the reel clicked. Once Elias looked up, nothing moved. He smiled to himself, old metal settling in the cool night air. That had to be all it was. He lay back down, closed his eyes, and drifted towards sleep. A few moments later, the reel clicked again. This time, it sounded almost patient. For the next several weeks, Blackbriar Lake became generous once again. At least, that was how it appeared. Each morning, Elias carried the old fishing pole down the familiar trail before the first light reached the water. Each morning, he returned with more fish than anyone believed the lake still held. Word spread quickly. Neighbors asked to borrow the pole. He refused, not because he wished to keep his good fortune to himself, but because something deep inside him insisted. The pole belonged only to him. When his wife gently suggested that perhaps another family could use it for a day, Elias surprised even himself with the sharpness of his reply, no. The word came out before he had time to think. The silence that followed felt uncomfortable. He looked down at his hands. I'm sorry. I don't know why I said it like that. His wife smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. It's only a fishing pole, Elias nodded. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a quiet voice whispered, no, it's yours. The thought vanished as quickly as it had arrived. He convinced himself he had imagined it. Life slowly became easier. Smoke once again rose from chimneys throughout the village. Children played outside. The church bell grew quiet. People spoke of the coming winter with cautious optimism instead of dread. Many even wondered aloud if perhaps they had judged the widow too harshly. None of them noticed that Elias was changing. He laughed less. He spent longer hours at the lake. Fish that would once have thrilled him now barely earned a glance. Each catch only made him wonder what might be waiting beneath the next cast. He began leaving before sunrise, returning after sunset. Sometimes he forgot to eat. Sometimes he forgot conversations entirely. His wife would ask him simple questions. He would answer several moments later, as though his thoughts had been somewhere very far away. Then the dreams began. Every night, he stood alone on the same wooden dock. The lake stretched endlessly in every direction. No shoreline, no trees. Only perfectly still black water beneath an endless gray sky. His fishing line disappeared into the darkness below. Something enormous pulled gently against it. Not enough to bend the rod, only enough to let him know it was there. He never saw what waited beneath the surface, but he always knew one thing with absolute certainty. If he reeled just a little longer, he would catch the greatest fish that had ever lived. He woke each morning before reaching the surface, heart racing, hands gripping blankets as though they were the cork handle of the rod. Soon, the dreams no longer remained asleep. While cleaning fish beside the lake one afternoon, he caught himself staring into the water. Something moved beneath the reflection. Large, slow, graceful. He leaned closer. The shape disappeared. He blinked. Only his own reflection stared back. That evening, the old reel clicked, not once, but 3 times. Click, click, click. Elias looked toward the fireplace. The fishing pole rested exactly where he had left it, yet the handle seemed warmer. He reached out and touched it. It felt almost alive, not breathing, not moving, simply warm. The feeling lingered in his fingertips long after he let go. The next morning, he returned to the lake before dawn. A thick blanket of fog drifted across the surface, swallowing the opposite shore completely. The world felt smaller, quieter. As though the lake had pulled the morning in close around itself, he cast his line. Before the lure reached the water, the rod bent hard. There had been no splash, no strike. Nothing had touched the hook, yet something was pulling. Elias instinctively pulled back. Whatever held the line released immediately. He reeled it in. The hook was empty, the bait untouched. He frowned. Perhaps the line had snagged a branch beneath the surface. He baited the hook again, cast once more, again, before the lure landed. The rod bowed toward the lake, not violently. Not enough to drag him forward, just enough to invite him. He stared into the fog. The pull stopped. His heartbeat echoed in his ears without realizing it. He whispered aloud, "What are you?" The lake offered no answer. Only silence, then very softly, from somewhere impossibly close. A voice not loud, not threatening. Barely more than a breath carried across the water. One more cast, Elias spun around. The dock behind him was empty. The shoreline was empty. Even the birds had fallen silent. He stood there for a long time, listening. Nothing. Eventually he laughed at himself. Too many early mornings, too little sleep. That had to be it. He made one final cast before heading home. The line drifted across the glass like water, then disappeared beneath the surface with perfect, effortless grace. The rod bent slowly, steadily. Not with the frantic struggle of a fish, but with the deliberate weight of something that had chosen to be caught. At first, Elias smiled. Every fisherman knows the feeling. That single moment when the line grows heavy, and every instinct whispers, "This is the one." He tightened his grip around the cork handle. The fishing pole bent into a smooth arc. The line slipped silently into the lake. There was no violent struggle. No frantic splashing. No sudden run toward deeper water. Whatever rested beneath the surface simply remained there, waiting. Elias began to reel, slowly, carefully. The old reel turned with a sound that had become strangely comforting. Click, click. Click, each rotation felt effortless. Almost as though whatever he had hooked wished to be brought closer. Minutes passed. The line never slackened, but neither did it grow tighter. It felt impossible. As though the hook had caught something that possessed great weight, without possessing resistance. He had spent nearly his entire life fishing Blackbriar Lake. He had caught sturgeon, massive catfish, ancient snapping turtles that mistook bait for prey. Nothing had ever felt like this. He stepped closer to the edge of the dock. The water remained perfectly clear, perfectly still. He could see several feet below the surface. Small fish drifted lazily through waving strands of grass. Nothing larger, nothing capable of pulling the line. Yet the weight remained patient, unmoving. He reeled another few turns. Click, click, click. The line angled downward into darkness, not because the lake was deep, but because, somehow, the bottom seemed farther away than it should have been. Elias frowned. He knew every inch of Blackbriar Lake. He had crossed it in every season. As a child, he had swum near this very dock countless times. The water here was shallow enough to stand, chest deep at most, and yet, looking down now, the lake seemed endless. His reflection had disappeared. The sandy bottom was gone. Only darkness remained beneath the line. A strange thought entered his mind. If I keep reeling, I'll finally see it. He didn't question where the thought had come from. It simply felt true. He leaned forward. Another turn of the reel. The line remained taut. Another. Still nothing. Another. The darkness below seemed to shift, not with movement, with shape, as though something unimaginably large had rolled lazily beneath the water. A shadow. Far below. Much too large to belong in any freshwater lake. Elias held his breath. His pulse quickened for just an instant. He thought he saw the outline of a fish. Then it became a log, then a boulder. Then something with shoulders. He blinked, the shape vanished. Only black water remained. He laughed nervously. I'm seeing things. His voice sounded strangely small. The fog swallowed it almost immediately. Then, without warning, the line became lighter. Not slack. Simply inviting. As though whatever waited below had drifted a little closer, the rod lifted slightly in his hands, almost encouraging him to follow. One step, that was all. One careful step toward the edge. He moved without thinking. The tips of his boots now rested against the weathered boards at the very end of the dock. The old wood creaked beneath his weight, still. He reeled, click, click, click. The sound echoed across the silent lake. Then something answered. Not a splash. Another reel, far away click. The sound came from somewhere out in the fog. Elias froze. He looked across the water. Nothing. Then again, click, this time closer. As though another fisherman stood somewhere beyond the mist, patiently winding in a line of his own. Elias, the voice was barely audible, soft, warm. Comforting. He recognized it immediately. His father. Impossible. His father had died 15 winters ago. Still, there it was again. Elias, come see what I've caught. Tears welled in his eyes before he understood why. He hadn't heard that voice in years. He took another step forward. The dock groaned softly beneath him. The fishing pole bent a little farther, not pulling him, leading him. The fog ahead began to thin, just enough for him to make out the faint outline of another dock. A solitary figure stood at its end, broad shoulders, a worn hat, one hand resting on a fishing pole, exactly as his father always had. The figure lifted a hand in greeting, then pointed toward the water. Elias smiled farther. The figure nodded once, then spoke for quiet words. One more cast, son, without realizing it. Elias lifted the rod behind his shoulder, prepared to cast again, never noticing that both of his feet now stood beyond the safety of the dock, balanced only on its narrow outer beam, with nothing between himself and the waiting water below. For a long moment, Elias remained perfectly still. The fishing pole rested lightly in his hands. The fog drifted lazily around him and across the water. The figure that wore his father's face continued to wait, patient, smiling, just as he remembered. It would have been easy to believe. Grief has a curious way of filling in the details we long to see. The worn hat, the broad shoulders, even the gentle tilt of his head. Everything appeared exactly as memory insisted it should. Yet, something felt wrong. His father had always waved with his left hand. The figure raised its right, only a small difference. The sort of detail another person might never notice. But memory is stubborn, especially the memories of those we love. Elias lowered the rod slightly. The figure did not move. It simply continued pointing toward the water, waiting. Then it spoke again. "Come." The voice sounded almost perfect, almost. There was no warmth behind it, no affection, only imitation, like someone repeating words they had heard, without understanding what they meant. The smile on the figure's face never changed, neither did its posture. It simply remained there, watching him, waiting for him to finish the final step. A cold breeze rolled across the lake. The fog shifted just enough. The distant dock disappeared. The figure vanished with it. There had never been another dock, only open water. Elias stumbled backward so suddenly that he nearly dropped the fishing pole. His heart pounded against his ribs. He looked wildly across the lake. Nothing, no boats, no fishermen, no father. Only silence. His breathing slowly steadied. "I've lost my senses." The words sounded hollow. He glanced down. The fishing line still disappeared into the water, still perfectly taut. Still pulling ever so gently, almost apologetically, as though asking him to try again. He knelt at the edge of the dock, reached toward the line. If it had become tangled around an old stump or sunken branch, he could simply cut it free. His fingers brushed the water. It was strangely warm, warmer than the autumn air, warmer than it should have been. Small circles spread outward where his fingertips touched the surface. The ripples carried across the lake, until they reached the fishing line. The instant they touched it, the entire lake answered. Ripples, thousands of them. Not moving away from him, moving toward him. Every tiny wave converged upon the line, as though the lake itself recognized it. The water began to hum, not loudly, a low vibration. So soft it was almost impossible to hear, yet Elias felt it in his chest, in his teeth, in the bones of his hands. The fishing pole grew warm again, warmer than before. The cork handle almost seemed to pulse beneath his grip. Once, twice, then it moved only slightly. The rod turned in his hands, not enough to escape, just enough to point itself toward the deepest part of the lake. Elias stared. His fingers tightened instinctively. The pole answered. It tightened with him. Not by bending, by holding. As though another hand had wrapped itself around the handle from the opposite side. He tried to let go. His fingers refused. Not because they were trapped. Because every part of him suddenly believed letting go would be the greatest mistake of his life. A quiet thought drifted into his mind. Don't lose it. Then another, nothing else matters. His wife's face appeared in his memory, then his children, for only a heartbeat. The images faded almost immediately, replaced by the water, the line, the promise of whatever waited below. His entire world seemed to narrow until only the fishing pole remained. Only the next turn of the reel click. The sound came without him touching it. Click, another turn. The handle rotated by itself. Click, again. Each slow rotation shortened the line. Each rotation drew whatever lay beneath. Closer. Elias wanted to stop it. He truly did. But another part of him, a growing part, needed to know, needed to see, needed to finish what had begun. Far beneath the surface, something pale drifted upward through the darkness, not quickly. Slowly, almost peacefully, he squinted. At first it resembled driftwood, then cloth, Then a hand human, floating upward with its fingers gently reaching toward the surface. More shapes followed. Another hand, a shoulder, the faint outline of a face, eyes closed, hair flowing like river grass, then another and another. Dozens of silent figures rising together from impossible depths. None of them swam. None struggled. They simply drifted upward, as though answering the same invisible pull. Elias could no longer breathe. He wanted to run, to scream, to throw the rod into the lake. Instead, he watched. Unable to look away, the nearest face opened its eyes, not with anger, not with hunger, only sadness. Its lips parted ever so slightly, and though no sound crossed the water, Elias understood the words as clearly as if they had been whispered into his ear. It never wanted fish. The fishing pole gave one final, contented click. The sound lingered long after the reel had stopped. Click. Silence. The figures beneath the water remained motionless. Their pale faces floated just below the surface, watching, not reaching, not threatening, only waiting. Elias could not move. The fishing pole rested in his hands with the quiet confidence of something that already knew how the story would end. He stared into the nearest face. It was unfamiliar, an old man with a gray beard. His eyes were open, peaceful, almost relieved. Beside him drifted a young woman. Then a boy no older than 12. None bore wounds. None showed signs of drowning. They looked as though they had simply fallen asleep beneath the lake. More shapes appeared behind them, dozens, then hundreds. The deeper Elias looked, the more impossible the lake became. Blackbriar Lake was small, far too small to hold so many people. Yet beneath the surface stretched an endless darkness filled with silent faces, as if the lake itself no longer obeyed the rules of the world above. Then the nearest figure raised one finger, not toward Elias, toward the fishing pole. The others slowly followed. One by one, every face beneath the water pointed at the rod. Not accusing, warning. A chill spread through Elias. His fingers finally loosened. He tried once more to let the pole fall. This time, his hand obeyed. The fishing pole slipped from his grasp. For the briefest instant, it hovered in the air, balanced impossibly upright. Then it struck the surface of the lake. Splash, the figures vanished. The endless darkness disappeared. The water became clear once more. The lake was shallow again, only sand, stones, and waving patches of grass rested beneath the surface. The fishing pole floated gently beside the dock. Perfectly ordinary, Elias stumbled backward, gasping for air. His clothes were soaked with sweat. His knees trembled so violently he could barely stand. He stared at the pole. Nothing. No warmth. No movement. No clicking reel. Slowly, he reached down and pulled it from the water. It felt cold, lifeless, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. He should have left it there. He would remember that thought for the rest of his life. Instead, he carried it home. That night, he said nothing to his wife, nothing to his children. He leaned the fishing pole beside the fireplace as he always had, then sat in silence until the fire burned low. Long after everyone else had gone to bed, he rose from his chair, walked to the fishing pole, and wrapped it tightly in an old canvas blanket. He bound it with rope, twice, 3 times, then carried it outside beneath a moonless sky. The lake was only a short walk away. He never hesitated. Standing at the end of the dock, he whispered into the darkness. "I don't know what you are." His voice shook, "but you will not have me." With all the strength he possessed, he threw the bundled fishing pole into the deepest part of Blackbriar Lake. It struck the water with a heavy splash. For several moments, the wrapped bundle floated, then slowly it disappeared beneath the surface. Elias remained there until sunrise. Waiting, nothing returned. No ripples disturbed the water. No reel clicked in the darkness. Only the first birds of morning greeted the dawn. For the first time in weeks, he slept peacefully. The dream stopped. The whispers faded. His appetite returned. Days passed, then weeks. Winter arrived. Snow covered the shoreline. The lake froze beneath a sheet of white ice. Elias never fished again. When neighbors asked why, he merely smiled and told them his hands had grown too old for the cold. No one questioned him. Years softened the memory. Eventually, he convinced himself that grief, exhaustion, and guilt had simply driven him to imagine impossible things. Until one spring morning, the ice had melted only days before. A young traveler arrived in the village with a wagon full of goods collected from settlements farther north. Children gathered around to admire the strange items for sale. Old lanterns, cooking pots, horse tack, weathered tools. Elias barely glanced at the display until something caught the corner of his eye. Leaning quietly against the side of the wagon was an old fishing pole. Its oak handle gleamed softly in the morning sun. 7 black knots rested beneath the reel, exactly where he remembered them. The traveler smiled. "Fine rod, isn't it? I found it washed up along a riverbank." He ran his hand across the smooth cork handle. "They don't make them like this anymore." Elias felt every ounce of color leave his face. Because the river the traveler spoke of flowed away from Blackbriar Lake, not toward it, the fishing pole had not escaped. It had returned, and somehow it had learned how to find its next owner. The traveler sold the fishing pole before noon, not to Elias. He never went near it. Instead, a young man named Samuel Carter purchased it for 3 silver coins and a promise to return with stories of the largest fish Blackbriar Lake had ever seen. He laughed as he carried it through the village. Several children admired the polished reel. An old woman remarked that it looked far too well kept to be so old. Samuel smiled. "I suppose someone took very good care of it." Elias, standing across the road, whispered to himself, "No, it takes care of itself." No one heard him. He considered stopping Samuel. He even took several steps toward him, but what could he possibly say? "Don't fish with that rod. It shows you dead people beneath the lake. It wants your soul." The words sounded absurd even inside his own mind. Samuel would laugh. The others would pity him. Perhaps they would decide the long winter had finally broken the old fisherman, so Elias remained silent. That silence would haunt him far longer than any nightmare. The following morning, Samuel walked to Blackbriar Lake before sunrise. Unlike Elias, he fished for sport. He carried fresh tackle, bright lures, a woven basket packed with food. He expected to spend the entire day enjoying the quiet shoreline. Several villagers passed him along the trail. Each remembered him waving cheerfully. Each remembered him whistling. Each remembered him saying the same thing: "If I don't catch the biggest fish in Texas today, I'll settle for the second biggest by evening. His basket was still sitting beside the dock, untouched. His lunch remained wrapped neatly in cloth. His hat rested on the weathered boards. Only Samuel was gone. The village searched through the night. Boats crossed every corner of the lake. Lanterns reflected across the water until dawn. They found no footprints leading into the forest. No signs of struggle, no broken branches, no blood. Only a single fishing lure hanging from the end of the dock. Its hook was perfectly clean, as though it had never touched the water. The fishing pole was gone 3 days later. Samuel's body drifted quietly against the southern shoreline. His hands were empty. His lungs held water. The village mourned. The priest spoke of tragic accidents, strong currents, cold water, unfortunate footing. Blackbriar Lake had claimed another life. That was all, but Elias knew better. He attended the funeral without speaking when everyone else had left. He remained standing beside the fresh grave. Snow-white clouds drifted overhead. The wind carried the scent of pine across the cemetery quietly. He apologized. "I'm sorry. I should have warned you." The trees answered only with silence from that day forward. Elias watched. Whenever news reached the village of an unexplained drowning, he asked only one question: did they have an old fishing pole? Most people looked at him strangely. Some laughed. Others shrugged. Occasionally, someone would pause before answering. Now that you mention it, there was an old rod found nearby, or my cousin said he'd found one washed up after the storm, or he bought one from a trader passing through. The details always changed. The ending never did. Years slipped into decades. Elias grew older. His beard turned white. His hands, once strong enough to haul heavy nets alone, became stiff with age. Still, he kept writing every drowning, every rumor, every mention of a weathered oak fishing pole wrapped with 7 black knots. His journals filled shelf after shelf. Dates, names, places, creeks, rivers, reservoirs, mountain lakes. It didn't matter where the water was. The pole always arrived first. Sometimes it traveled hundreds of miles between victims. Sometimes only a few. There was no pattern except one. It never chose someone who disliked fishing. It always found people who loved the quiet, people who respected the water, people who believed that patience was rewarded. It didn't lure the reckless. It preferred the devoted, because devotion is far easier to guide than fear. Near the end of his life, Elias wrote one final observation beneath a page already crowded with names. His handwriting had become uneven. The ink faded where his trembling hand paused. The final sentence read, "I once believed the fishing pole carried the curse. Now I fear." The writing stopped for several inches before beginning again. The pole is no longer cursed. It is simply alive. When neighbors entered his home 2 days later, Elias was gone. The front door remained locked from the inside. His bed had never been slept in. His boots still stood beside the fireplace. His journals rested neatly upon the table. The only thing missing was the old canvas blanket he had once used to wrap a fishing pole. The villagers searched 4 weeks. They found nothing. Not a footprint, not a body, not even a hat floating upon the water. Only one strange discovery was ever recorded. Early one morning, A fisherman claimed he saw an elderly man standing at the end of a distant dock. The man held no fishing pole. He simply stared across the lake as though waiting for someone. When the fisherman rowed closer, the dock was empty. But resting against one weathered post was a familiar oak rod. It's real. Turning slowly on its own. Click, click, click. The official records of Blackbriar Lake contain no mention of a curse, no mention of a witch, no mention of a fishing pole that appeared in different places throughout history. Official records rarely do. They document what can be measured: dates, locations, names, causes of death. Everything else is dismissed as rumor until the rumors begin repeating themselves. For nearly 2 centuries, that is exactly what happened. A drowning here, a missing fisherman there, a recovered fishing pole with no identifiable owner. At first, investigators treated each incident separately. Different lakes, different states, different decades, different victims. There was no reason to connect them, until a retired county archivist discovered a pattern hidden among old reports. A photograph from 1912, a newspaper clipping from 1947, a police inventory from 1983, a ranger's incident report from 2016. For different locations, for different investigators. One identical object, an old wooden fishing pole. Each report described it differently. Weathered oak rod, vintage fishing equipment, unknown antique fishing pole. But every photograph showed the same thing, the same curved handle, the same aged reel, and beneath it, 7 black knots. The discovery led investigators to reopen dozens of unexplained drowning cases. Most contained very little: missing equipment, unanswered questions, families who never received closure. But several shared details that could not be ignored. Victims often reported hearing something before disappearing. A voice, a familiar voice. Someone they loved, someone they trusted. A lost parent, a deceased spouse, a childhood friend. The details changed, the result did not. Every victim was convinced there was something waiting beneath the surface, something worth one more cast, one more chance, one more moment, one final answer. The archivist's files describe this phenomenon as the invitation, not a command, not a threat, an invitation. Because the fishing pole never forced anyone to approach the water. It never dragged anyone from their homes. It never chased anyone through the woods. It waited, it offered, it promised, and humans have always been drawn to promises, especially the ones that sound like dreams. Recovered from Evidence Locker 19 was a collection of Elias Thorne's handwritten journals. Most pages were damaged, some were nearly unreadable. Water stains covered entire sections. Yet one entry remained strangely preserved. The date was unclear. The handwriting suggested it was written near the end of his life. It read, "I spent years believing the lake was hungry. I was wrong. The lake takes what enters it. The pole only convinces them to step closer." Beneath that, a second sentence, written darker, as if pressed harder into the paper. "It learned from us." As if pressed harder into the paper, it learned from us. Investigators initially assumed Elias meant the pole had become valuable, that people had learned its history, that stories had spread. But further examination of the journal revealed something far stranger. Elias described the pole changing, not physically, Not in appearance, but in behavior, he wrote. The first man was angry, the second was curious, the third was lonely, the fourth was grieving. It does not hunt, it studies. The final pages became increasingly difficult to understand. His handwriting became larger, more frantic, as though he had been writing while afraid. One passage repeated several times. It remembers every hand. It remembers every voice. It remembers every wish. And then the final entry. Only 7 words. 7 words written across the center of an otherwise empty page. The next fisherman will not be warned. The last confirmed appearance of the fishing pole occurred beside a remote lake nearly 2,000 miles from Blackbriar. A park ranger discovered it resting beside an abandoned dock. No footprints, no vehicle, no camping equipment. Just the fishing pole standing upright against a wooden post. The ranger later reported something unusual. He said he never touched it. He never picked it up. He never moved closer. He simply saw it. And when he looked away, for only a moment, it was gone. The incident was classified as unexplained. The report was filed. The case was closed. Until 3 months later, a fisherman visiting the same lake disappeared. Search teams found his boat drifting several yards from shore. Inside, everything was perfectly organized. His supplies, his tackle, his belongings, except for one thing. The fishing pole he had brought with him. It was missing. Investigators searched the water. They found nothing. Then, while reviewing security footage from a nearby trail camera, they noticed something impossible at 5:43 in the morning. Before the fishermen arrived, before anyone entered the area, before the disappearance occurred, the fishing pole was already there, leaning against the dock, waiting. The final image captured by the camera showed the fisherman approaching. He stopped, looked at the pole, and smiled, as if seeing an old friend. The footage ended 11 seconds later. The camera recorded no movement, no struggle, no fall. Only one sound, a sound barely picked up by the microphone. A slow mechanical turn, the reel spinning once, then again. Then a final time, click, click, click. The official case remains unsolved. But inside evidence locker 19, the fishing pole remains exactly where it was placed, wrapped in canvas, bound with rope, sealed behind reinforced glass. The investigators responsible for securing it made one mistake. They assumed keeping it away from people would prevent the cycle. They never considered that the cycle was never about finding people. It was about being found. The first rule of preserving an artifact is understanding what it is, not what it appears to be. Not what people believe it to be, but what it truly is for years. The fishing pole stored in evidence locker 19 was classified as a historical object, a piece of old equipment, a strange coincidence connected to a series of unfortunate accidents. That explanation was easier, because the alternative required accepting something far more disturbing. That some objects are not simply used. They are not simply carried. They are not simply owned. Some objects choose. The archivist stands alone beneath the dim lights of the archive. The room is quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of silence found in places where countless stories have been preserved, but never truly forgotten. On the table in front of him rests the final artifact, wrapped carefully in faded canvas. 7 black knots visible beneath the folds. The archivist does not touch it immediately. He studies it. The same way he has studied every object brought into the collection, with patience, with caution, with respect. Because history has taught him something. The most dangerous things in the world rarely announce themselves. They do not roar. They do not chase. They wait slowly. He unwraps the canvas. The fishing pole rests beneath it, unchanged, perfect. The wood does not appear damaged by age. The reel does not show signs of rust. The line remains attached, even though no one remembers attaching it. The archivist looks down at the 7 knots, 7 reminders, 7 witnesses. 7 promises made by a woman who lost everything, a curse born from betrayal. But as the years passed, the curse became something else. Something that no longer belonged to her. The archivist quietly reads from the recovered documents. The original intention was punishment, a pause, however. He turns the page after enough time. The artifact developed its own purpose. The room remains silent. Then, the fishing reel moves. Just slightly, the archivist stops. He does not reach for it. He does not step away. He simply watches. The reel turns once, click. A normal person might call it old machinery. A loose mechanism. A coincidence. But the archivist has learned not to mistake movement for accident. The reel turns again, click. The fishing line slowly extends, not falling, not unraveling, moving with intention. Sliding across the table, the archivist follows the line with his eyes. It moves beyond the edge of the desk, across the floor. Toward the darkness between the shelves, he whispers, "You are not searching for fishermen anymore." The reel stops for a moment. Nothing happens. Then the line pulls tight, not toward the pole, away from it, as though something unseen has taken the hook. The archivist looks toward the darkness. His expression changes, not fear. Recognition, because he understands now. The fishing pole was never the fisherman. It was never the hunter. It was the bait. A way to lure people closer. A way to create the perfect moment. A way to convince someone to lean just a little farther. To take one more step. To make one more attempt. To chase something impossible, the greatest catch. The final answer, the thing waiting beneath the surface. The archivist slowly reaches for the canvas before he can cover the artifact. A sound echoes through the archive, faint, distant, impossible. Water dripping, one drop then another. He looks down. The floor beneath the fishing pole is wet. A small puddle forms beneath the table, but there is no leak, no pipe, no source. Only the sound of water, and then something else. A reel turning. Not from the table, from somewhere deeper within the archive. Another artifact, another story, another forgotten thing. The archivist watches the darkness between the shelves, then quietly says, "It was never trapped here." Silence. "It was brought here." The fishing pole bends slightly. The line tightens. Something pulls from the other end. The archivist finally covers the artifact. The movement stops. The water disappears. The archive becomes still again. But before leaving, he notices something written beneath the old canvas. Words that were not there before. Fresh, dark, wet. 3 simple words, one more cast. The archivist closes the file. The recording ends, and somewhere, far away from evidence locker 19, beside a quiet lake, a forgotten fishing pole rests against an empty dock, waiting not for someone who loves fishing, not for someone who seeks adventure, not even for someone who believes in curses. Only someone curious enough to pick it up. Someone willing to believe that maybe the next cast will be different.